very much. Further debate? The member for Timiskaming Cochrane.
Thank you, Speaker. It's always an honour to be able to rise in this House and express the feelings of the NDP caucus and my leader, Andrew Horvath. And today it's a special honour for me because we're talking about an agriculture subject. And I never thought that as a farmer I would ever stand in the legislature and talk about agriculture. So it's an incredible honour for me. And before I begin on the actual on Bill 40, it's been a fairly agricultural day here in the legislature. We've discussed contaminated soil on farmland, something that the government could act on Monday. We've discussed trespass rights, property rights, something that the government, maybe not Monday, but Tuesday. No, but the one on the contaminated soil, I really want to stress that one. That's one that needs to be acted upon. There's no political animosity to stop it. The only thing the government has the will to do it. That's the only thing that's stopping that issue, Speaker. You've time allocated everything else. So what's stopping it? The minister without portfolio, who I really respect, says we're not being reasonable, but the government hasn't given the other parties a chance to be reasonable.
The government's not reasonable right from the
But let's return to the project at hand, which is Bill 40.
I will start with the title from the bill. An Act to amend the Crop Insurance Act, Ontario, 1996, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. And I will continue with the explanatory note. The bill amends the Crop Insurance Act, Ontario, 1996, to expand the scope of the Act. Currently, the Act applies to agricultural crops and perennial plants. The bill would expand the Act so that it would apply to all agricultural products that are designated by the Minister by regulation. The title of the Act is amended to reflect the expanded scope of the legislation.
Version of that, I'm going to read from the Hansard from the minister's opening on this, and he explained part of it very well. And this is from Minister Leal. As we all know, Ontario farmers grow and harvest a diverse range of crops and livestock. When unforeseen challenges such as pests, weather, and disease strike, production insurance is there to provide coverage for losses and yield reductions. In Ontario, production insurance is currently available for nearly 90 different agricultural products, but Ontario farmers grow and raise more than 200 commodities. This leaves some farmers' products ineligible for production insurance. If passed, the proposed, and here's where I have a bit of a problem, this next sentence. And before I go any farther, we support this legislation. Very much so. And I said in my opening statement when I responded to the Minister Leal a few days ago that the one thing about this legislation, that this legislation was actually at least 10 years too late. Because the actual impetus from this legislation was passed at the FedProv Agricultural Ministers meeting of 2003. And the parliamentary assistant to the minister said that this was moving forward with haste. With haste. With haste. Yes, we are going to address that question again. With haste, the parliamentary assistant said. With haste is 11 years. Well, this government's been in power for 11 years.
A snail's pace haste.
And in response, the parliamentary assistant responded. Once again, I'd like to quote from Hansard. I particularly want to address the member from Timiskaming-Cochrane. It's fantastic that he has pointed out that it's been 12 years. I'd like to point out, of course, that in those 12 years there was a different member for Beaches East York.
And a great member.
As he notes, the great agriculture riding of Beaches East York was commented on earlier. Maybe that was the big change in the last 12 years in this government, that there's a different member from the wonderful riding of Beaches East York. I would celebrate that it has only been a scant 6 months that I had the pleasure of being elected to this House following the last election and being appointed as the Parliamentary Assistant to Agriculture. Maybe that is the key ingredient as to why we're finally able to move forward with this. Well, I've had, when I was in another life, when I was working with Dairy Farmers of Ontario, when I was working with the Federation of Agriculture, I've had the honour of working with many Ministers of Agriculture, Steve Peters, Carol Mitchell, Leona Dombrowski, the Premier, the Minister of, I believe he's now the Minister of Municipal Affairs. And I bet you they would be surprised to learn that it's the member from Beaches East York is the only reason that this government is now bringing this forward.
That's right.
The man who doesn't know the difference between an alfalfa field and an alfalfa patch. No, and this isn't funny. This is why many farmers have trouble believing that the government actually understands them when they see statements like this. We all know it's not one member or another member. The real reason that this legislation, in our opinion, is being brought forward now, 10 years too late, but brought forward nevertheless, is because, yes, the government is taking a bit of heat on the neonicotinoid issue right now. And I'm going to speak to that. I've got 53 minutes left. I will get to that eventually. But that's the real reason the government's looking for a win. And this is a good issue. At any time in the last 11 years. It's worthy to note, Mr. Speaker, that Ontario is the last province to actually move in this direction. You know, we sometimes hear that Ontario is a leader in climate change, and I'm going to get to that too, if I don't run out of time. We're a leader in climate change, and the government says we're a leader in this. Well, they're certainly, absolutely not a leader in agriculture production insurance. They're not a leader, Speaker. They're a laggard. And that's important to know. So, as much as we support this legislation, and one thing about this legislation, at least it doesn't have the usual fancy Liberal title, but we're going to see, I'm fairly positive, that we're going to see big news releases that this is going to be a big change for farmers, and this legislation in itself is not going to be that change. There is a lot of work and consultation to be done. This is a step, an important first step, but it's merely a step. Now I got to go to page 2. So, how production insurance, and I'm going to give a little 101 on how production insurance works from the governmental side, how we see it working, and how it works from a farmer's perspective. So, and in this introduction, we're going to find out really why farmers can't access this as easily as the minister and the parliamentary assistant are telling us. The cost of production insurance is shared by 3 partners: farmers, the provincial government, and the federal government. And it's shared 40% by farmers, 24% by the province, and 36% by the feds. And there's the issue. Because there's no money on the table. So we've waited 11 years for a word, but there's no money on the table. And that's really important, Speaker. Because we know that there's no money in a lot of places. In fact, a lot of places are losing money. And there's another program that farmers work together with previous ministers of agriculture. It's a risk management program. So production insurance, what we're talking about today, covers the actual production. So how many tons of crop you get from a field, how many bushels of potatoes, how many, okay? Risk management covers the price you get. So with risk management, you can insure yourself to make sure that, you know, because crop prices go up and down, so it can kind of even it out. And the agricultural groups with the government, with the provincial government, got together and they did a really good job. And they created a risk management program, bar none, for the province of Ontario. It was bankable, it was predictable, and that's what agriculture needed. And then this government capped it. So it was estimated that this program to run efficiently and to make sure that the agricultural sector, the base production sector, which actually drives the agri-food industry in our province, which creates, I believe, $30 billion or $34 billion in economic activity and fuels 740 or 50,000 jobs. That's all based that the primary producer is solid and has bankable and predictable, so he can go to his bank and say, I need to borrow X so I can plant my crops. And that's what we had with the risk management program. And then this government capped it. So it's no longer bankable or predictable. Does it help? Yes. Are the commodity organizations going to chastise the government? No. Because at the end of the day, it's the government. But in all reality, Speaker, for that risk management program to work, the cap, and it has to be, you know, raised close to what it was when a program was originally designed, which is between $175 and $200 million. And why that's important? Why that's important, before I lose my voice, why that's important, and why that has something to do with production insurance, is because for the production insurance to be moved over, or for the umbrella to cover more commodities, the money is going to have to come from somewhere to pay the province's portion. And that hasn't been identified. And until that's identified, because it could very well be that they could take another 25 or 30 million out of risk management and put it into crop production insurance, and that really wouldn't help anyone. That would actually be a step backward. And that's a very important thing to realize. Because until we start talking how the dollars are going to work, pardon me, we're all just talking. And that's a very, very important step. We've waited 11 years, you know, because I'm sure after that Fred Prov meeting in 2003, the commodities that weren't covered were pretty excited because Ontario was going to move in the right direction. And they've waited 11 years for a word. And who knows how long we're going to have to wait till we actually have the regulations in place and the money. And that's very important. So that's how it works. That's how it works from the government side. Okay? So a farmer puts 40% in, the province puts 24% of the premium in, and the feds put 36%. That goes into a pool, and if there is a loss, then the money comes out of the pool. And the idea is enough farmers participate so the pool's big enough and the risk is put over enough acres and over enough commodities that there's enough money in the pool to pay out those who have the misfortune of having crop loss due to pests, due to weather, due to disease. That's how it's supposed to work. And for the large part, crop insurance is a good program. It has its hitches. All programs have their hitches. I hope that Agri-Corps doesn't go to the same program that they're using for ODSP, because we'll have a lot more hitches. There is a few glitches, but overall, I don't think we are not going to advance our argument by complaining about Agri-Corps, because overall, Agri-Corps is not the problem. But there is a problem. I'm looking for a way to word this. And I'm going to go back to the minister. And here was where I was very disappointed with the minister's statement. Because he didn't focus on a lot of the things that are concerning farmers right now. And I was surprised because this government makes lots of noise about being focused on these issues. So in his statement, and I'm going to read the same statement again, a part of it. As we all know, Ontario farmers grow and harvest a diverse range of crops and livestock. When unforeseen challenges such as pests, weather, and disease strike, production insurance is there to provide coverage for losses and yield reductions. Now, I was expecting him to spend quite a bit of time talking about pests, and that's what the neonicotinoid issue is about. Weather, because we hear climate change, and we are not climate change deniers. I know on my farm in Northern Ontario, we grow crops now that we couldn't grow 15 years ago. Partly because of better genetics in the crops, but partly because we're getting more heat units. Okay? But the weather is more unpredictable. And we've heard the Minister of Climate Change, Environment and Climate Change. I keep thinking he's only the Minister of Climate Change, but he's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, which is kind of the same thing. Talk over, or speak in this House about, increasing food prices, and it's going to be much more unpredictable, and obviously the ministers don't talk, because that's going to impact crop insurance immensely. And I'll give you an example in my riding for this year and last year. So the way crop insurance works, it works a lot like other kinds of insurance. So if you have a claim, your premium goes up. Pretty simple concept. And the reason that is, I understand it. Sometimes farmers get a bit adventurous and they grow crops where you grow corn where you know the corn's not going to yield too good, and so if you keep doing that, sure, you'll collect crop insurance once, but your claim will go up, and that stops you from doing that in the future. Good. I don't have a problem with that concept. Where that runs into trouble, though, is where, due to climate change, a whole region can't get its crops off. So that whole region, not due to any fault of the farmer, will have a hike in their crop insurance. And if that happens again, they'll have another hike in their crop insurance, and they won't be able to buy crop insurance because it'll be too high. And you know what happens, Speaker, when you can't buy crop insurance? You can't get a loan to put in your crops, because for many, you have to, before the bank, and I don't blame the bankers, I'm not anti-bank, before the bankers will extend credit to a farmer to put in a crop, they want proof of crop insurance. So on my case, in Temiskaming-Cochrane, last year, we had a pest that we've never had before. And it is called the Swede midge. the Swede midge. Neither had we. Temiskaming Cochrane grows more canola, or grew more canola, than anywhere else in Ontario. We are the canola capital of Ontario. And why? Because our temperature is a little bit cooler. We had ideal conditions for canola. And quite frankly, we could make pretty good money growing canola. So we all grew canola. Then comes the Swede midge. Now, I'm not a scientist, but what the Swede midge does, it goes for the growing point of the plant. And it kills the growing point so that the plant compensates by growing around it and starting over. But as a result, the plant never matures. It just keeps growing and growing and growing and never produces a crop. So we sprayed, and we sprayed, and we sprayed some more. But a lot of the fields were a total write-off. Okay, so that was not this summer, last summer. So the ones that were crop insured got crop insurance, but their premiums went up. Their premiums went up because of that pest. Okay, everybody with me now? So this summer, a lot of people didn't grow canola because the Swede midge is going to stick around for at least 4 years. So a lot of people didn't grow canola, so we grew other crops. Corn, soybeans. This was the worst summer we've had in, the old-timers tell me, since 1965. The coldest, wettest. So a lot of our crops didn't get off. So now, those farmers, that's hit number 2. Not their own problem, not their own cause. It wasn't bad management. It wasn't cutting back on fertilizer. It was purely weather. And if I'm listening to the Minister of Environment and climate change, could very well be climate change. But now those farmers are behind the 8 ball. Because they've had they'll have 2 claims in a row. And even on a personal level, not my personal, but I'll take an example. So we have some fairly big farms in the Temiskaming Cochrane. And some of these farmers are cash croppers, elevator owners, and custom farmers. So they'll come and custom combine your grain. And this was, like I said, usually we have snow in around now it starts. We've had snow for a month. So I remember the member from Holland and Norfolk was talking about snow beans. Ours should be like blizzard beans because we haven't seen them for a while. But some of those farmers, a good friend of mine, and he's not alone, but he's a good friend of mine. His family, Norm Cook, and some people here might even know Norm Cook. If Norm and his kids, Rob and Chad, if you ever go through Earlton, drive through the Trans-Canada Highway and go through Earlton, you've got this town of Earlton on one side and Cook Farms on the other side, and they're both about the same size. It's a big farm. Family farm, but a big one. Norm does a lot of custom combining. And Norm is a good custom combiner. And Norm treats your crop like his own. Well, this year, Norm didn't get a lot of his own crops off because he saved a lot of other people he got their crops off. Now Norm is going to pay the price. And I think that's something that we have to look at. And that wasn't mentioned at all, what climate change is going to do to crop insurance. What pests that we've never seen before are going to do to crop insurance. And what they're going to do to the commodities that the government is proposing to cover. Once again, we're totally in favor. No problem at all, Speaker, about supporting this bill. But we were extremely disappointed that the minister didn't take some time and actually, recognize that there are going to be, if there's going to be huge changes in the climate in the future, in fact, I think the change is happening already. It's getting pretty dry in here. If there's going to be huge changes in the climate in the future, and we've gone from, it used to be, the climate was only going to get hotter, I think it's going to be more erratic because that's what we're experiencing. There's going to have to be some kind of mention how that's going to impact climate change, or how that's going to impact agriculture, and how that's going to impact individual areas. Because I know in Temiskaming Cochrane, there's not too many alfalfa. There are fields in Temiskaming Cochrane, not patches. Yeah, we don't have alfalfa patches. We have alfalfa fields. But all jokes aside, and I'm sure it's not the only place in the province, but I know my friends and farmers very well in Temiskaming Cochrane. They're going to have a real tough winter. And it's going to get tougher next spring because it's going to be hard for some of these people to get affordable crop insurance, and not because of lack of management ability, purely because of pests and weather conditions that they have never experienced before. It's a good example for the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, but I was extremely disappointed that the Minister of Agriculture or his parliamentary assistant didn't even bother to mention that. I think it's really important. You have to, I don't think, I'm trying to word this correctly. I don't begrudge people who don't have an agricultural background for not totally understanding our sector. I don't totally understand other sectors all that well sometimes. But we do expect that ministers of the Crown take the time to truly understand what's going on. And I truly hope that going forward, that we actually have a working relationship and don't hear too many more cracks about how it took a member from Beaches East York to bring this forward. Because that won't go over well in the farm community. It won't. And we all want to work together, because this isn't really it shouldn't be a politically divisive issue. But it could very well become so. Another issue I'd like to touch on, and it's an issue that's been in the news a lot of late, and that's the use of neonicotinoids. There are areas, and again, I'm going to talk about this in two different levels. From the legislative level and from the dirt level, the people who actually plant. Is there a problem with neonicotinoids? I don't think anyone's going to deny that. Okay? Can they affect pollinators? Yes. They are a pesticide. It's not rocket science to think that a pesticide could affect insects. That's not rocket science. There was an issue with acute poisoning of bees, and that happened because the dust coming off the treated seed and the equipment that farmers use created more dust. That was identified, and the agricultural sector and the equipment sector and the seed companies and the chemical companies worked together to solve that problem. And I think the acute poisoning problem from dust has been largely, if not eliminated, you can't honestly say that it's been eliminated, but it's been largely controlled. I think we can be safe to say that it's been largely controlled. We are left with the issue now, and the government has they have made an announcement on this issue. We are left with the case of that there could be systemic problems yet with neonicotinoids. And from our party's position, we're not going to stand here and say, well, that can't be, because there very well could be systemic problems with neonicotinoids. But I'd like to back up a step where these problems actually started. I'm going to go back even before neonicotinoids. Over the years, agriculture has evolved, and we've changed, and I remember when I started farming, I mold board plowed everything, right? And then that was a no-no because we need conservation tillage, so we went to conservation tillage. Then we went to no-till. No-till doesn't really work well in my area, so we went back to conservation tillage. So we made lots of changes. And when I started farming, there was lots of public research to help you. But over the years, the government has backed away from public research. And companies have taken up the slack. And I don't blame them. I really don't. Now, the federal government, I think, has been more guilty of trying to push science away and trying to push it to other people. But the province as well has backed off considerably on agriculture research. And as a result, all the research that was done was private, by private companies who were out to make money, as I was when I farmed. So it's no surprise that when the government, no, I'm going to back up. It's no surprise that farmers use a lot of chemical products for insurance. And that's basically what neonicotinoids are. Some areas of farmland need them. Some crops need them. Not all crops need them. But no one was actually paying for the research to see exactly where they were needed. And that's one thing the government should be doing now, is actually, if you're serious about there's some places that don't need neonicotinoids, help us find ways to actually test accurately to know when and where. And where that comes back to the crop insurance issue is if you're going to restrict the use of something that is used everywhere else, there are going to be yield impacts. And they're not going to be divided. The yield impacts aren't going to be all over the same. So some farms are going to be hit much harder than others. Some crops are going to be hit much harder than others. And that's going to impact their crop insurance. So if your crop goes down because you can't use a chemical, then you'll get a payout for 1 year, maybe, but you won't the second year, and your premium is going to go way up. And where that's even a bigger problem, fields are fairly big now. At least in my part of the world, they're fairly big. And they're not that uniform. So you could have 3 or 4 different types of soil in the same farm. So one type of soil might be more prone to soil-borne insects than another type of soil. So to say that we can't use something, because how do you do that? If you have a 100-acre field and 20 acres in the middle of it needs, 20 acres needs protection from wireworm or whatever, and the other doesn't, how do you get around that? I know how I got around it in my farm. I didn't have a big farm. I farmed about 500 acres, and I farmed, in my final 500-acre farm, I had 300 acres, which I have about 250 left, was beautiful soil. The kind of soil after rains you can still go on there and not make mud, just beautiful soil. But in the middle of that farm, there was like 40 acres of the clay they made the pyramids from, Speaker. You know? And it didn't matter what you did, that soil was always 2 weeks later. And if you touched that soil a day before it was ready, all you had was parking lot. So I was a smaller farmer, and my bigger cash crop neighbors around me kind of laughed, but I had a 100-acre field that was split into 3 triangles, or 2 triangles and a straight stretch in the middle. And why I did that is because as a smaller farmer, I could do that. So I could compensate for that. But bigger places can't. They can't come back and make those changes, Speaker. And that's something we have to realize. So the government has made this announcement, and there's just a couple examples. But the government has made this announcement of an aspirational goal, and I like the word, in this case, I like the word aspirational. Most time I get a little bit leery from the word aspirational. But this time, I hope they truly mean that. Because the agricultural sector really wants to work. It's not in the farmer's best interest to destroy the environment. It's not in the farmer's best interest to destroy the soil. It's not in the farmer's best interest to hurt other species of animals. But a farmer needs the tools to operate his farm profitably. And if the government is going to take those tools away, then the government has to take steps that the farmer can still compete with other areas. Because otherwise, the base of the agriculture sector on which this province depends won't be healthy, and we won't be able to create all those jobs. It gets even trickier when the province is making pronouncements on things that are actually a federal responsibility. So then some of our provincial counterparts, which farmers have to compete against, will have access to products that we won't have access to. So in effect, you're creating an island, Speaker. And when you create an island, I have friends who have I have a cottage on a lake, and I have friends who have a cottage on that lake, but they're on an island. And everything is harder to get to the island. So when you create an agricultural island, it becomes more difficult. And that's the government's decision to make. But the government has to realize the ramifications of creating the island. You have to step up to the plate if you're going to do that. And crop insurance is one place where that will rear its head. So, if we can look ahead on the neonicotinoid file, we need to spend a lot of research and time, public research, to find ways where we can test, where we can use, where we need it, and where we don't. It's really important. We can't just say, we have to use this much less, and that's it. I'll give the government credit. There is no aspirational target on canola, because canola really needs it. I grew canola for a long time, and before neonicotinoids, we used organophosphates to kill the bugs. And organophosphates were way more dangerous. They were dangerous, they were dangerous to use. And that's something else you have to realize. If you don't look at the whole picture, you can ban one thing, but you have to make sure that you know what's going to replace it. Because some of these crops aren't going to grow without those tools. So you have to look at the whole picture. And I really hope that on this issue, that the government takes the time to actually listen to farmers and work with farmers for the long term. And I think, to their credit, on the acute problem we have with neonicotinoids, I think the government recognizes the work that the farmers have done. And I hope that they will continue and work with agriculture, but they're going to have to realize that to really come up with viable tools, so we can use, or so we can produce using less pesticides, we're going to need research dollars. And we're going to need public research. Because I don't see why anybody's surprised that when you leave all the research to the people who make the chemicals, if you expect them to do the research, that you don't end up using more chemicals. That's not rocket science. Something else, a lot of people bunch the neonicotinoid problem with genetically modified GMOs. And actually, and you can have your own views on GMOs, but actually, because of GMOs, we use a lot less pesticide than we did 20 years ago. So the people who want to ban GMOs and ban neonicotinoids, the two actually, you can have your own views. I perfectly respect people who want to buy organic. I perfectly respect it. I'm not a big believer. But if people want to buy organic, perfectly respect it. There's a reason why organic should be more expensive, because by and large, you don't get the yields from organic that you do from commercial, I don't know what you'd call, the word isn't commercial, but what's the word when you're not organic? What are you? Conventional. Conventional, that's the word I was looking for. Organic crops are harder to grow. Something usually with organic field crops, you use a lot more fuel. So for the people who want us to use less fuel, when I was a kid, before what's the chemical that, Roundup. I farmed before there was Roundup. And Roundup kills a lot of things. Roundup's actually a very safe product. It's safer than table salt. So table salt is more poisonous than Roundup. But before there was Roundup, we had our worst weed in my part of the world was quackgrass. Quackgrass is like it's a killer weed because it's a grass, it's a perennial, so it's got miles of roots, miles and miles of roots, and if there's quackgrass, nothing else grows. So before Roundup, there was all kinds of things we tried to do. But what my dad did for quackgrass is we'd pick whatever field had the words quackgrass, and we would summer fallow. And summer fallowing is basically you cultivate that field so you keep it black all summer. And I can remember, that was my job. I was a little kid, and I was cultivating that field. So you don't grow a crop on that field. You just keep it black all summer. And you don't see that anymore. And that's not really that good for the environment because you use a lot of diesel fuel. And then after I was done cultivating, every time, or while I was cultivating, you have to pull up the cultivator and pull all those quackgrass roots off the cultivator. And you'd have to do this every week, the whole summer. And we used all kinds of diesel fuel. And we didn't really kill the quackgrass either. We just kind of set it back. And then Roundup came. Roundup was a wonder product. But it also has a problem, Speaker. So I can remember when Roundup was first commercialized, when we first started using Roundup, and it was expensive back then. I think it was $40 a liter when I started using it. Yeah, $40 a liter. But everybody told us nothing is ever going to be resistant to Roundup. You know what, Speaker? There are now lots of weeds that are resistant to Roundup. So you have to be careful how you use a product. And I think that's a lesson for neonicotinoids too. You have to be careful how you use a product. Because if you use it too much, eventually the things you are trying to control are going to develop resistance. I'm not a scientist speaker, but I farmed for a long time. And Roundup's my example. When I started, Roundup wasn't going to have any resistance, and now there's lots of things resistant to Roundup. So, do we need to do things about neonicotinoids? Yes. Is the government's announcement the answer? No, not by itself. Not by itself. What we've called for, and I think the government is a bit late on this, only people who have, you need a license to spray in this province. You have a commercial license, you have a farm. I have a license to spray in this province. A farmer license, and commercial applicators have a higher level of license. We could have done this last year already, that you need a license, you need that sprayer license to be able to handle neonicotinoids. Would have made a big difference. And it would have increased people's confidence. Because it's not just anybody who can use it, because it's a pesticide. You should be licensed. And most farmers are licensed, not all. That would be a step. Would have been a step we could have done already. An easy step. Would it have been a big headline? No. But it would have been a step. Just like nutrient management plans. They were a huge step. Pest management training courses. That's how you got your license. You know, those are things we have to do. And those are programs that are in place. And one thing we haven't done, this government has done a very poor job at it, is actually, and not just this government, I think even agriculture itself, of actually telling people what actually happens with agriculture in this province, how strictly it's regulated. And that's another problem when you make and they haven't announced a ban of neonicotinoids, but it very well could be. Once you create the island, you're still having people come in and off the island with boats. So, if the issue is that you don't want a neonicotinoid product, you don't want to have products that have neonicotinoids, you're going to have to do a lot more than ban neonicotinoids in your own little part of the world. And I'll give you an example, Speaker. I'm a dairy farmer, so I like talking about, I was a dairy farmer. I will be always. And when the people at Timiskaming Cochrane get sick of me, somebody will probably hire me to milk cows. So, but we're going to talk about another issue. There was a huge issue about a decade ago, and it was something like neonicotinoids. RBST. RBST. So it's called bovine somatotropin. And it's something you can inject into a dairy cow, and you'll get more milk. Okay? Yeah, I won't respond. So, in America, this was all the rage. It comes from Monsanto. It was all the rage. And it's easier to milk cows when you have BST because you can give them a needle, and it's a complicated story, but you don't have to breed them as often, and you can give them a needle and get a lot more milk. But if you think about it, you know, injecting like basically steroids into cows, is that good for your milk? Not really. Well, you know what? We never used it in Canada. And why we never use it in Canada is because we have a unique system to supply milk in Canada, supply management, and Canadian farmers never wanted it. Why? Because they didn't think that people would accept it, but we didn't need it because our milk price was protected. So we got a fair price for our milk. So there was no desire, because we got a fair price for our milk, because we didn't really have to compete with milk coming in from other places. And as a result, consumers benefited. They benefited not only from a stable supply of milk, but they benefited because they never had to deal with BST. And now they use a lot less BST in the States too, because people just didn't like it. So that's how, if the government does something, you can control what's used and not used. But with neonics, it's different, because the farmers who don't have access still have to compete with farmers in Quebec, farmers in Manitoba, farmers in Michigan. So they're going to be at risk. So the government's got to recognize that and look for ways that we can see where we need it and where we don't, and look for ways how it's going to impact things like crop insurance. Because for certain farmers, if they don't have the access, and if we put rules in place that actually, because we have a tendency to do that. We have a tendency, the government has a tendency to put rules in place that sound really good here, but don't work on the ground. So we've got to make sure that if we're going to put stricter controls on neonics, which we agree with, we have to make sure that the programs are in place on the ground to make sure that it can be accurately identified where neonics can be used and can't. That in places where neonics can be used, that the farmers actually have access. Because when it's time to plant, and if you're going through 6 months of regulatory process to get the ability to use them, you can't plant in October. And that's a big issue. So, can we regulate? Should we regulate neonics strong? Should we have stronger regulation? Yes. But those regulations have to make sense from the ground. In closing, Speaker, it's going to be a 6-minute and 19-second closing. I'm going to have to check my notes to see what I missed. Neonicotinoids. Next steps. In closing, I'd like to once again, we are in favor of this bill. Absolutely. Should this bill be traveled? Quite frankly, I'm not sure. Because this bill is just a change of a few words. I don't think I could find a farmer in Ontario who's opposed to this bill. Or I could find a couple. Farmers are a contrary bunch. So I could find a couple who would be opposed to this bill. But by and large, the farm community is going to be in favor of this bill. I've spoken to many people in the farm community. Actually, I got a technical briefing from the ministry, and as I was walking out in the hall, Matt Bowman, who's is Matt president of Cattlemen yet? He should be. He's on his way. He's in my riding, and he's an excellent farmer. He's a big representative of the Ontario Cattlemen. And I met him in the hall just outside the legislature on that day. He said, John, he said, Matt, what are you doing here? So I just got a technical briefing about the new production insurance. He says, well, it's about time. And I agree with him. It's about time. I've talked to the pork producers. Amy Cronin, I believe she's the chair of the pork producers. Great lady. And yeah, and she's very in favor. So, and very capable of representing her industry. So I think there's pretty well universal acceptance for this bill. Where we're going to have to be careful is, and where this bill is going to need extreme scrutiny, is when we actually get to the working parts and where the money is going to come from, how the programs are going to be developed. That's going to be crucial. Because we all know what happens when we don't take the time to develop the programs right. And one of the things hopefully that this bill will save, will change, is that we won't need as many ad hoc programs. because ad hoc programs can be a disaster. Because I'm sure we have all been contacted by I can't remember the name of their organization, but they're young pork producers who didn't qualify for the program when there was the disaster program for pork. And they're very diligent people. I commend them. And they're right. They were starting their careers, they got Zippo, and people who are ending their careers got a bunch of money. And that's what happens when you have an ad hoc program. Because it's put together quickly, because the government's trying to react to a crisis, and you make mistakes. And unfortunately, that happened 8 years ago, so those mistakes will never likely be remedied, Speaker. So, hopefully this program will make less need of ad hoc programs. But it's going to be very important how it's put together. Because if you look at the risk management program that was developed by the pork producers, the beef producers, and then was capped by this government, we very well might still have the need for ad hoc programs. Because if crop prices crash, as they've done, and if that stays like that, one sector could very well drain that program and render it basically useless. Not useless. Useless isn't the right word. Could render it, basically it'll drain the tank and it won't get the job done. And you still might need an ad hoc program.
Ineffective.
Ineffective, thank you. And that's something we really have to worry about. So, we need to do a lot of consultation with producers on this. I think we need to do much more consultation with producers on neonics than what's being proposed. Much more. Because believe me, farmers across the province want to solve this problem. But they need to understand, they need to have confidence that the government actually wants to work with them. And that's going to take more than just a couple of sessions, and it's going to take more than that. It's going to take a commitment from the government to actually fund the research so we know in a timely manner where we can and where we don't need neonics. And my final minute, I'd like to reiterate that for crop insurance, for any type of crop insurance to be effective in the future, especially with this government, when they keep telling me, when the Minister of Environment and Climate Change keeps talking about the huge impacts that's going to have for agriculture, well then, the crop production insurance program in this province has to take those into account. Because otherwise, producers are going to bear the brunt, and then producers are going to fail. It's happening right now in Temiskaming Cochrane. There has to be changes made to the crop production insurance program this winter in Temiskaming Cochrane, or there will be farmers, from no fault of their own, will not be able to afford the crop insurance that they need to get operating capital to put in their crops. Thank you, Speaker.